In this lecture, we're going to talk about some historical and theological problems in the book of Joshua. Those problems include the problem of Israelite holy war, the problem of archaeology at Jericho and Ai, the nature of the settlement, and Rahab's lies. The problem of holy war. The problem is this. When Israel went into Canaan, they were told to utterly destroy everyone, men, women, children, and beasts. And indeed they do that at Jericho. They utterly destroyed both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey with the edge of the sword. The problem is this. Is this not immoral or sub-Christian morality? Well, let me give you my solution to this problem. I point out that Israel had rules of just war given in Deuteronomy chapter 20 that were actually meant to limit the destruction of war. In Deuteronomy 20, you were first of all to make a people an offer of peace. In other words, if you can negotiate a peace, then you need not kill anyone. Deuteronomy 20 goes on to say this, that if they refuse peace, then you may lay siege to a city, and when the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, you may put to the sword all the men in it, but the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you are to take these as plunder for yourself, that you may use the plunder that the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. Now the items here in yellow are places where I have modified the NIV translation to what I consider a better translation. But the point is this, that the first rule is you offer terms of peace, but the second rule is if peace is not accepted, then you limit the killing to the fighting men. The Hebrew allows for the possibility of translating all those will. You will lay siege and you will kill all the men, or shall, can be translated may, giving permission rather than mandating that you must. And I think that's the more likely interpretation. So killing of women and children is not allowed according to the rules of war. And we've already talked about how the rules of war also tried to protect women taken as captives. We had that account in Deuteronomy 21, 10 through 14 when we looked at the book of Deuteronomy. Now, of course, they did do this at Jericho. They killed the women and the children. But the rules of war in Deuteronomy 20 says that you are not to. In either case, when you lay siege to a city for a long time, fighting against it to capture it, do not destroy its trees by putting an axe to them, because you can eat their fruit, and do not cut them down, or the trees of a field people that you should besiege them. However, you may cut down trees that you know are not fruit trees, and use them to build siege works until the city at war with you falls. So after offering terms of peace, if peace is or is not accepted, the third rule is avoid unnecessary destruction. Not destroying the fruit trees is an illustration of this broader principle. In hermeneutics we would call it synecdoche. One example is something to represent a broader category. Cutting down the fruit trees would be an example of vindictive, unnecessary destruction, kind of a scorched earth policy in war, and Israel was not to engage in that. The problem then of Israelite holy war is not one of their not knowing rules of war. These rules of war that you only fight as a last resort, you limit the killing to the combatants, and you don't kill the women and children, these were codified by theologians St. Augustine and Ambrose into what is called just war theory. And they may well have drawn from this passage in Deuteronomy in formulating their hypothesis. So Deuteronomy comes very close to the just war theory that's developed later on in the church. But these rules are limited to those outside of Canaan, not the Canaanites. Those inside Canaan were given a different set of rules. There it says in that same passage in Deuteronomy 20, in the cities of the nations that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave anything alive that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hivites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God commanded you. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things that they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. So with war against the Canaanites, they were to kill everybody. They were to be placed under the ban. Ban is the Hebrew word cherem. Cherem means dedicated to God for destruction. And so an exception is made in the case of the Canaanites. And the question is why? Why an exception for the Canaanites? The Bible's answer is one that you may or may not find helpful, but it's because they were exceptionally wicked pagans. Now, it's not just that they were pagans. There was no general command to make holy war against all the nations of the world. But this group was especially wicked. They practiced things like human sacrifice, mentioned in Leviticus 18. Moreover, they were given time to repent. Back in Genesis 15, it says that God said to Abraham, or Abram as he was called at the time, that it was not until the fourth generation after the Israelites would sojourn in Egypt that they would come back to the land of Canaan and take it over, because, gives a reason, the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. The sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. What does that mean? It means they haven't sinned enough yet. God waits another 400 years until they have sinned enough to justify Joshua's invasion. Moreover, if they were allowed to stay, the Canaanites would lead Israel astray. They will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods. And so they needed, for that reason as well, to be eradicated from the land. Now note that some had escaped. The language is this, that they were to drive out the Canaanites. Now, if I were a Canaanite and I saw the Israelites come to Jericho and kill everybody, and then go to Ai and kill everybody, and then I saw them coming towards my city, I think I would be inclined to get out of town and get out of the country. And so most would have fled the land rather than be killed. So they were to drive them out. It assumes that many of them would not be actually killed. Moreover, Rahab and her household were spared in Joshua 6 because she helped the Israelite spies. They promised to spare her, and they did. She ends up being in the lineage of Christ, as it turns out. The Gibeonites were spared. They were spared because of deceit. They pretended they were not Canaanites and made a treaty with Joshua, but nonetheless they were spared. Even the city of Shechem seems to be spared. There's no battle at Shechem, no king of Shechem that was killed, and yet we know there was a significant population at the time of at that time. What may have actually happened is this. We know from the Elamarna tablets that which is correspondence between Amenemhotep III and Amenemhotep IV, pharaohs of Egypt, and their vassals in Canaan. We know from that there was trouble in Canaan, which was nominally under the control of the pharaohs, from a certain Labayu, king of Shechem. He was said to be in league with a group of people called Habiru and creating problems. Now, these Habiru may be the same as Hebrews. And if that is true, and I can't prove it with any certainty, but if it happens to be true, it would explain why the city of Shechem was spared. What would have happened is they made league with the Habiru. In other words, they made a treaty. They, in effect, converted to Israelite religion, at which point they became a part of the covenant, which would then explain why in Joshua chapter 8 there is a covenant renewal ceremony at Shechem. So to bring this discussion to a conclusion, why was it that Israelites did this horrific war against the Canaanites? It's not because they were ignorant of rules of just war. They actually had rules of just war. But the Canaanites were made an exception to those rules because the Canaanites were an exceptionally wicked group of pagans who deserved it. And even so, many of them could run away. Gibeonites and Rahab were spared, and even some may well have converted. We'll continue discussion of problems in Joshua in the next lecture.